All right, thank you. Welcome to our talk, Through the Portal and Back, Designing VR Experiences for Public Spaces. This is actually a version of a talk we gave at GDC this year. Actually, it was Jeff and I who gave the talk, and we're fortunate enough to have Dare with us today to share some of his work on the projects. So, a little bit about us. Jeff comes from a fine arts background and taught for many years at RISD and the New York Academy, and all three of us work at Harmonix. Worked on a bunch of titles over the years, and surprisingly, one of the most relevant is our work with Connect on Fantasia Music Evolved. We found a lot of parallels in VR design from the work with Connect, things like designing motion controls, working with tracked play spaces, and trying to create engaging interactions that might lack tactile feedback. Jeff and I, actually all three of us, recently we're working on the Music VR project. I'm the code lead, and both Jeff and Dare are on the art team. And I've been tinkering with VR since the early days of the DK1, the early Oculus dev kits, and probably the most important project of my life as a side project, Alien Makeout Simulator. So that one is a super silly project, but it was really inspiring because it was done during a game jam that Valve sponsored, I think it was 2 years ago, and they brought some prototype VR hardware that would eventually become the Vive, and I believe it was the first time I'd experienced positional tracking and presence in VR, and so it really proved to me that this is like going to be an amazing medium, and there's so much potential for this.
Today we're here to talk about the work we've done with Secret Portal. Secret Portal is a group that we founded a couple years ago, and we're a group that's really interested in finding ways to use virtual reality in public spaces. Specifically, finding ways to get someone who is inside virtual reality to interact with someone who is outside of virtual reality, kind of work together toward common goals and see what happens when that kind of thing starts to happen. We are a group of artists, coders, musicians, and engineers. And over the last couple of years, we have done installations at the UMFA here in Boston. In 2014, our installation was called Across the Divide, and just this past year, we did something called Between Lands. Both of them involved virtual reality. In the first year, we just only had head tracking, and this last year, we had full room scale virtual reality. Just to give you a little introduction, that'll help understand and contextualize some of the stuff we're going to be talking about over the next 20 minutes, half hour or so. I want to describe a little bit of the game design for our most recent project. So in a room in the Museum of Fine Arts, it was a pretty large room, and we had a trackable space right in the middle that was defined by a kind of series of walls, of barriers, of tables. And outside of that, the audience could wander around and go wherever they wanted over the course of a 30-minute long presentation. And then while it was happening inside that space, there were a series of 4 pairs of people. One person was inside virtual reality, the other person was outside of virtual reality, and they had to work together toward a common goal. I'm going to show you a video of that happening, explain a little bit over the top of the video as it starts going. You'll see there's a lantern. That's the person outside of virtual reality who's guiding the person who's carrying a torch inside virtual reality. And they're having to work together to light these beacons around the room, and with each beacon came music into the room. So as they're lighting more beacons, the room is filled with light and music, and so is the virtual space. I'm trying to let you guys hear this because the audio is awesome.
We'll skip out. All right, I'm going to very quickly try to fix this. Sorry about this.
Yep. A huge part of this installation was the audio. It's all about, and so if you don't hear it, you really miss out.
Okay. You guys getting anything?
No, I'm not even hearing it from here now.
Anyone have an idea?
Okay,
so we'll go back to that. Sorry, guys.
This is part of our presentation. It's here to emphasize the fact that we're in real reality now. And in real reality, shit happens. It's also related to a part... Never mind.
Where's the speaker on this thing? The magic of Apple.
Is the audio ambient, instructional?
It's mostly ambient and gives you a feel for what we were creating. It's not instructional though. Alright, well, we tried.
Can't watch it. So what is it about public spaces and virtual reality that interest us? One of the things we were really influenced by were other forms of technology and the ways they engaged with the public sphere. Specifically, the Connect. There were a lot of ways in which artists use Connect to kind of put art in surprise places. So people would be wandering through some place and suddenly they'd be engaged in an art activity that they hadn't expected. And we really liked that sense of kind of surprising people with art, and also the ways in which people were transformed from just passive observers of art into becoming active participants in the art itself. And that's was really inspirational for us. Specifically with room scale VR, the things that are really made available to us are, first of all, the ability to be site specific. Virtual reality can always transform you from wherever you are into some amazing place that's awesome, but when you know the site you're in, we can take advantages of the specificity of that site and use it in some really unique ways. I'll be talking about that a little bit later in the presentation. Secondly, using virtual reality in public spaces allows us to take advantage of this really powerful metaphor of having someone who's in one reality interact with someone who's in another reality, having very different experiences in terms of what they're experiencing, but also some sort of commonality. So in some ways they're taking these two realities and they're bridging that gap. And that for us presents all kinds of wonderful metaphorical possibilities of people coming together across different worlds to work together. And third, it presents the option, the ability to use custom props and sets that normally just wouldn't be available in home use. And Dare's going to talk about that in a little bit, so the ways we've used that specifically. And third, another thing we really like about being able to have VR in public spaces is the ability it's a great way to introduce people to virtual reality who haven't used it before, on two levels. The people who actually can put the headsets on and go into VR obviously get to experience it, often for the first time, and people who are coming to a museum are often people who never had this chance to do this, so it really brings it to a whole new audience. But also, just the people who are watching have the chance to see these people having an amazing experience, and even though they may not get to put the headset on themselves, they get to realize that there's this great thing out there, and they can become excited about it and look forward to a time when they can also do it.
So we think that room scale VR is a crucial component for works made in public spaces. And first of all, we now feel like that this might be a hot topic, but though people are pushing the boundaries, comfort issues right now are pretty well understood if you follow the rules. Don't accelerate the camera, don't turn the camera without the player turning it themselves, and if you do that with room scale hardware, it kind of does the rest for you, right? We had a wide range of people use our installation, all ages, and had no physical comfort issues. Now, there were some other comfort issues that we ran into that we're going to talk about, but sickness is not a problem with room scale VR by following the rules. Second, having a large 360-degree tracking volume is really important because it means that participants can lose themselves in the space of your exhibit. You don't need to design them into facing a particular direction so a camera sensor can see them. They can just wander around and they just lose their whole sense of where they are. And finally, we see a huge potential in the interaction between these spaces that are overlaid, these realities that are overlaid, and the worlds that are contained within them. And that participants can walk through them freely, and information can flow into and out of these realities, and it presents some really new opportunities for new types of experiences.
Well, one of the big challenges we faced was finding ways to engage everyone in the activity, both the person in virtual reality, the person who was a participant who's outside of virtual reality, but also the audience, the people who are watching. And this was a big challenge for us. During our first year, we really didn't do such a great job of it. And you can see this the woman who's here in the audience just clearly not having the time of her life there. bored out of her poor mind. And so we started to ask ourselves as we went into the second year, how can we take more advantage of the audience? How can we make them more active participants? How can we engage them more? And this is not just an issue for us doing this kind of unique outsider thing of VR public spaces and museums, but it's also an issue for people who are doing VR it's going to be in living rooms and using social screens like PlayStation VR. There's the same thing. You've got people who are watching the event. How can you engage them? How can you make them feel active and engaged as well?
So the rest of the talk is organized into a series of lessons learned over the last 2 years. And these really emerged out of the challenges that we had in constructing those two experiences. We're hoping that the things that we're presenting are general enough that they apply to any experience you might be making for a public space. So the first lesson is connect your physical and virtual worlds, make it social, evolve your content, and plan for the unexpected. So first I'm going to talk about connecting your physical and virtual worlds. So the first point is fairly obvious. You have to design your physical and your virtual environments together. And when you do this, you can make it an experience that's tactile for everyone. And that means that when you're in VR and you look and you see something, you can reach out and touch it. Now, of course, we can put a fantastical skin on top of that structure, but all the crucial elements are going to be there, and and it's just going to make it a more three-dimensional experience for people. It's really also interesting to explore objects that can bridge these realities. So what that means is these are objects that participants manipulate that create feedback across both realities. And it starts to almost create this sort of true mixed reality. I know right now these mixed reality trailers are really popular. They show VR in a way that is understandable to people. And in a public space setting, it's almost like having a mixed reality that's just unfolding right in front of you. And it makes it really, really magical for audiences.
Another really great way we found to help bridge the two realities is to really take advantage of the site itself and really make the site a character. And one way we did this in our first year, in the 2014 exhibit, was in the actual architectural site. We were given a space that had this big wall of windows. And so we designed the physical sculptures to be these emanating light sculptures that came out of kind of away from the head of the person in virtual reality, out toward the windows, to kind of invite the people who are the public who is outside of the space, on the other side of the windows, into the exhibition, into the installation itself. In the virtual world version of that same installation, we created an actual 2-scale version of the room that people had just left in the museum. It was slightly abstracted, but everything was identical as the room they just left, so that the onboarding was really easy. The person went into virtual reality, especially if it's their first time in virtual reality, and instead of being transported immediately to someplace crazy, they were transported to someplace slightly magical, but very, very familiar to the place they just left. And that allowed them to kind of slowly move from there into the wonderful stuff that we had in that version as the walls fell away and all these big animating musical sculptures started to come into play. And another thing that we found is really powerful to bridge the physical and the digital is to have objects that exist in both realities. In this case, we had a couple props and some set elements. We had this torch and a lantern and these large light beacons that were these tall pyramids. And one of my favorite things that I loved doing when we set this up was putting on the virtual reality headset and having the lantern kind of waving right in front of me and being able to take the headset off, put it back on, take it off, put it on, and that thing stayed exactly the same, but everything around it changed because our in-game representation of the object was identical to the real object, thanks to all the magic that Dare did, and he's going to talk about now.
Yeah, so we're used to building digital objects and digital situations, and turns out in the physical world it's a little different, and there's no undo button, I found out. But yeah, just a little bit on actually developing this. So as you may have seen earlier in the video in the beginning, there are 2 tracked objects in the space, in addition to obviously the VR helmet. And so those 2 objects become the thing that the audience is able to understand as sort of the bridge between what the person who's experiencing virtual reality space and what they're observing in the real world with 2 actual humans walking around the space. So it was necessary for them to be very much one-to-one. So here's the torch, which is the primary prop that we used. This was the thing that the person who was inside VR was holding, and they were using that to as sort of a magical element that could pull light and color from one beacon and transfer it to another. So it needed to be able to wirelessly communicate with the computer that was running the virtual simulation, which turned out to be a little tricky at times, but we did end up figuring it out with a lot, thanks to Mike, really. He did all the hard part. But so yeah, basically extensive concept art phase, about 5 minutes, and then starting to search for some just satisfying materials that would be sturdy enough, so a piece of driftwood. In order to get exact parity, what we ended up doing is, once we knew what the structure was going to be for the body of the torch, built it in a 3D program, flattened it out into a template, sent it to a vinyl plotter, and cut it out, roughed it up with some sandpaper, and constructed it. So really, as Jeff mentioned, when you hold the thing and you move it in the virtual space and you pull the helmet up, it's in this exact same spot. It's the exact same scale, and there's something very satisfying when you're in the VR. And then for the rest of the onlookers, I think it helped when they would see the people operating these elements and then look at the screen. We had a large screen in the back of the room, which was a feed from the VR headset directly to basically a movie screen. So people who were watching, if the person with the torch was watching the torch, they would see that motion in the physical world, and they'd also see the person's visual feed up there. So aside from the body of the torch, we actually had to have a bunch of circuitries in there. Because it was wireless, there was a bit of a jerry-rig scenario to operate this LED strip. And Mike made some really nice, he coded up some nice animations that there were many game states that had to be shown in the virtual space as well, in the physical space. So when we finally had success, this is just a quick little shot I took. I think I cut, you don't have the audio of me screaming yes, right at the moment when that worked, but yep, that was the wireless hurdle. And that was development of the torch.
Awesome. Thanks, Dare. So once we created all these objects and they were represented in both realities, we found that it was really interesting to create connections between them, and those would create these magical moments for the audience. A really simple way to do this is to have an object carried by a person in VR or outside of VR that responds to another object when they come in close proximity. So simple example, transfer light from one object to another. So here's an example from the installation. You can see here the torch being held by the VR participant, and they hold it near one of our sculptures, and the light is transferred from the sculpture and it ignites the torch. And the action is clearly represented in VR and in the room. And for the audience, this makes the rules of the world more intuitive because they're plainly observable right in front of them. They don't need to look at the screen and try to intuit what's going on. They just look at what's happening and it's right there for them. We also went the other way around. So in this example, she's using her torch to ignite one of the sculptures, and we found that it's really fun to play around with how these events are represented in both realities, trying to play to the strengths of each medium. So in VR, you see this giant wave of particles rise up into the sky, and that really helps the player, sort of take in the depth of the space that we've created there. So once we had all these cool but distinct things in each reality, we started to ask ourselves, is there anything that we can do that can kind of bridge both realities that everyone there can share equally? And the solution we came up with was audio. So instead of having a person in VR who's wearing headphones and is kind of in their own world, we created this spatialized audio setup using 8 speakers. So what's interesting about this is that audio can then emit from physical objects, and everyone will hear it just the way it should. So instead of doing all your fancy binaural audio simulation in the headphones, it's just real audio simulation, right? And so, for one example, we had a speaker with each one of those sculptures, and when they're ignited, a voice sings, and it emanates from the sculpture. And as the installation goes along, more of those are ignited, and more voices join, until it creates this choir that surrounds all the participants. And it creates this really magical progression over time. And since the audience is free to walk around, they're able to get their own unique perspective based on where they're standing. So the interesting takeaway here is that we found that music can be this really powerful common thread that bridges both realities.
Our next set of challenges and lessons learned all relate to the social aspect of using virtual reality in public spaces. Basically, we have three different scenarios in which virtual reality can be social. The first would be having multiple people in virtual reality meet each other in a virtual space and interact with each other. Another would be having someone in virtual reality and someone outside of virtual reality interact with each other. And a third is having someone in virtual reality interact with a group of people who are outside of virtual reality. Over the last couple of years, our focus has been on the second, kind of really trying to get that core interaction of the one person in and the other person out to be meaningful for both of them, and so they really feel like they're working on a common goal together. We made a lot of great progress on that in our most recent installation, but the place we really want to start working, we made some good progress on this third too, and getting the audience more engaged. We really want to keep working on that and finding more ways to get the audience to be more active participants in the event.
So if you do choose to go down this path of having interaction between someone outside VR and someone in VR, here's a bunch of best practices that emerged through our experiments. The first one is to clearly establish a clear goal and make sure that both participants have a distinct role in accomplishing that goal. So for example, in Between Lands, the goal was to find and illuminate a sculpture. The person outside VR knew the way, and the person outside VR knew the way, the person in VR had the torch, and they could perform the action. So right there, they both had their distinct roles, and they needed each other. Second, it's very important that all the participants are able to see each other. So that means that they need to be tracked, right? The person in VR has to be able to sense the presence of the person or people outside of VR. So for us, we put the HTC Vive controller embedded inside of our custom props. Now we didn't have full body tracking, so there was some amount of finagling as they sort of bumped into each other a little bit, not knowing where their bodies were. But actually, we did get around it a little bit by just in the way we designed where they went from place to place to kind of minimize that. And in the end, it did require a little bit of communication, which is nice, which we wanted to happen. And of course, as we have the ability to track more points on the body, we'll revisit this and see if we can represent the non-VR participants in a more realistic way. Another really useful thing to look into is to have elements that are only perceivable in one reality, and that facilitates the need for communication. So the simplest example of this were these waypoints that we had on the ground that were all over the ground, these little coils of EL wire. And those were what we used to guide the lantern carrier so they knew where the next interaction was going to be. But of course in VR, they couldn't see this, so that's why they needed to follow the person with the lantern. Of course the lantern also illuminated the space. It was pretty dark, and so having that other person there to help show you the way was a nice metaphor. And then a more interesting example, we had this treasure chest that would pop up in VR, and it had a lock on it. And the only way to open it is by having both participants put their props in an exact spot in 3D space, and they had to do it at the same time. So that means that they have to communicate, they have to work it out, they have to figure out some weird way to talk and get their hands in the right place, or point, or talk. And it was really interesting to see how people actually work together to do that. Basically, the more each participant depends on each other, the more they are engaged in working together.
And as we've talked about a little bit before too, we'll go a little more deeply into it. The audience in our interactions is a really key element. Most of the people who are participating in this are actually the audience. And so the struggle we've had over the last few years is to find ways to really make them feel engaged. Our first thought, our first year was they're going to feel really engaged simply by mirroring. And by what mirroring was Dare was referring to it earlier, we had a big screen, and on that screen everyone could see through the eyes of the person in virtual reality. It was just showing that point of view. And we thought, that's going to be awesome. They're going to have this great empathy for the person in virtual reality. It's going to be magical for them. They can feel like they're seeing through someone else's eyes. And that just didn't work really at all. It wasn't interesting for very long, and for a lot of people, especially if they've never done VR before, they really didn't understand what that was. Even though we told them, they still didn't quite get it, that they're seeing through the eyes of the person in VR. It just didn't really make sense. So mirroring, we found, was just not enough to keep the audience engaged and make them feel part of what was going on. And so one of the things we're trying to start doing is find ways in which the audience themselves has a unique point of view. What is it that's unique to the audience that's different than everyone else participating? And what we've started to come around in the last year, and we're going to be emphasizing kind of more going forward, is this idea that the audience kind of has this God's eye view. They can see what's happening in the physical world, and they can also see what's happening in the virtual world through the mirroring. And there's some ways that this unique point of view that they have will allow them to kind of become more involved or become more active participants. And the next level of lessons learned and challenges had to do with evolving our content. And basically we wanted to find ways in our most recent installation to evolve the content over 2 time periods, or 2 arcs. One was the 4 or 5 minutes that each pair was in virtual reality, and the other was the overall 30 minutes of the whole time that the audience was in the room before we go to the next group. And first I'm going to talk about how we evolved time in the 4 or 5 minute chunks, and the main thing we used there was an evolving sense of the space. So the first thing that happened when the person entered virtual reality was they would be brought into a space like our 2014 installation that was quite familiar. It was the same scale as the room they just left. The lighting was quite similar. Thanks to this year, we had Don Rivers working with lighting on us, which was amazing. So we've got these amazingly beautiful lighting setups. So we would kind of make them feel familiar. They have a sense of the large space beyond, but just to kind of hints at it. And so they begin in the known, and then they slowly move into the unknown. The other thing we did right away to help them feel comfortable in this space was we created a platform that was exactly the size of the trackable space. And it turned out that this worked perfectly to tell people where they could and could not walk. We had this kind of magical fog down below it, and nobody tried to walk off the platform. And there were tables and kind of barriers around, but nobody walked into the barriers. We didn't need to use the Vive chaperone system because everyone just knew, and no one tried to walk off the platform. So it was a really great way just to intuitively tell people where they can go and where they can't go in a way that felt really, really comfortable for them. So what we then would do very quickly is they'd have to walk through a portal. So here you can see there's this portal that the lantern carrier is revealing, and the torchbearer is then walking through that portal. And once they walk through the portal, they're transformed into a completely different space. And what we wanted to do here was really contrast the space to emphasize the magic of VR. So they went from the space that was comfortable and similar to the space they'd just been in, and suddenly now they're in this huge, vast space with these monumental sculptures, and just really, really transformed because far away from what they had just been in as possible. And then they walk through a portal again, and now they're in a space like a cave. There's these stalactites coming down they have to kind of avoid with their head. And of course, you could just put your head right through it. It was really great watching people could avoid what this thing that really wasn't there. I did it myself even when I'm in VR. I'm like, oh, I don't want to hit that. Now, I'm in VR all the time. I still avoid stuff. And they could also kind of explore the space with their torch. They could hold their torch up and really kind of explore the ceiling and find these cracks way up high. And so really very quickly, in a period of 4 or 5 minutes, we were able to just make someone kind of go through this arc of going from a space that felt comfortable into these really, really different spaces to really emphasize very, very quickly this amazing thing that can only happen in virtual reality.
So your typical VR demo is between 5 and 10 minutes, and generally most people see the same content. And the problem with this in public spaces is that it just bores the audience, right? We had this problem in our first installation. People would come by, they'd check it out for 5 minutes, and then they'd leave. There was no reason for them to come back because they'd already seen everything. So for our newer work, we started to think about how we can evolve things over time. So maybe that means telling a longer story, or maybe that means having an audiovisual experience that evolves over time. What we ended up doing is inviting groups, about 40 people in at a time, every 30 minutes, and we planned a narrative arc that occurred over 4 turns. And so here's what, I wish the audio was playing, but this is what the experience looked like as people entered the room. And it was really dark and mysterious, and we thought it did a really good job of setting the tone that created a curiosity in the audience, and also encouraged people to keep the noise levels down because they came in almost feeling like prepared to experience something. And then after the first set of participants, some voices were singing, the virtual reality world was illuminated a bit, and same with the physical room. But still the voices are implying this mystery, there's minor chords in there, and then as more participants go, we slowly shift the music from minor to major, and the color palette from kind of the dark mysterious to bright and joyful. And then at the end, the very last set of participants go, we have a finale. And here's a look at someone's experience in the finale. Now, this woman's celebration was a complete surprise, right? She felt compelled to perform like that in the moment. And it's this really interesting thing that's happening that, you have someone who's wearing a VR headset and they can't see the audience, but, consciously they know people are watching them. And some people take advantage of that. And I think it's a really interesting thing to use in a game design, to think about the fact that even though people are immersed and that your primal senses think you're somewhere else, you're still aware that there are people out there and there's an interesting dynamic to create there. And then for the audience, this whole longer arc created a beginning, middle, and end, and had a reason for people to stick around for more than 5 minutes. So our next topic is kind of practical. This is about what do you do when things go wrong in a public space. And so, first of all, when you're dealing with a public space, access to the site can be limited, especially in a museum, unless you're a more permanent exhibit. You're not likely to get in there more than a handful of times before you go live. And so what you're seeing here is a look at my apartment about 2 weeks before the installation. And, there's equipment everywhere, there's wires everywhere. It's only about half of the trackable space that we had in the real experience. So I could test that all the systems are working, and technically it works, but I didn't exactly know how people were going to behave. And of course, we did do a few run-throughs, but definitely things happened that we didn't expect. Second, it's important to realize that people in a public space come in all shapes and sizes. So that means that your interactions need to be placed at a comfortable distance for everyone. So for us, that meant putting them at about waist height for the average adult, so the kids could play too.
Another thing, too, that Mike was starting to allude to is that you don't know how people are going to behave when they're in this experience, and they often do things that they don't expect, especially when we don't have a lot of time to do a lot of play testing because we're only in the space a little bit beforehand. And sometimes that's awesome. Things happen like the woman who performed at the end. It's unexpected, like person really feeling the immersion and really getting into it. But other times it's not so great. And one of the things that was not so great helped us to reveal a really interesting and unique thing about anxiety in virtual reality that was really unexpected for us. And it wasn't that the person in virtual reality became anxious, it was that the person outside of virtual reality became anxious. So one example of how that happened. So there was that interaction I've already kind of explained where the person holding the lantern had to walk to this X, which is a spot that they're told to go to. And when they get there, it reveals a portal, and the person who's in virtual reality can then see that portal. Here you can see it happening in the game. There's the lantern, the portal's popped up, the person holding the torch is standing a distance from it. Great, I see the portal, now I don't need to walk through it. It all works great in our minds before we get there, and when people do what they're supposed to do. But what turned out that happened was that the person outside of virtual reality, the person in physical reality, the person in virtual reality was really comfortable. They could walk through the space like, I love it, I'm here, this is awesome. They felt really comfortable in the trackable space, but the person outside of virtual reality was really freaked out. They're like, this person is blind, they can't see me, they've got this weird thing covering their eyes, certainly they can't see me, and even though we told them that they could, they didn't believe it. They wouldn't walk away from them. They insisted on being right there, on holding the lantern right in front of their face, or on holding their arm and guiding them. So of course that meant that when they got to the portal, it popped up underneath both of them, nobody saw it, and now whoops, it kind of screwed up the whole thing. But it really revealed this really cool thing, which was that, in this case, the people getting anxious weren't the people in virtual reality, it was the people outside of virtual reality, which was really kind of interesting discovery to make. So luckily, we hadn't exactly planned for that, but we did have a series of cheats that we could activate on a gamepad or a mobile device. And we found that, you can be a clever operator and just make it work. So they're getting close to where the door is supposed to appear, and I just press the button, no one knows. And it sounds like cheating, but actually the more I think about it, the more it lets this thing be more improvisational, right? It means that you can react to what people are doing and you can make things happen instead of just sort of coding it for one specific scenario. And of course, you can also observe these problems and then fix your code to make certain things run more smoothly on their own. But it was a really interesting thing to realize. At first, 2 turns were a little bit rough, but then after I realized that I could do this, it went very smoothly.
Another thing that inevitably happens with VR is that your computer overheats, or you lose tracking for unknown reasons, or the batteries die, or hopefully not, but sometimes your app crashes. And so we found that just creating an autosave system, just like you would for a game, works perfectly. As key moments are encountered, we remember that. If we have to pull the experience down and bring it back up, boom, it's right back where we left off. So it's a useful thing to keep in mind.
Another lesson learned was managing crowds. Our first year, we just had people waiting in a long line to be in virtual reality for 4 or 5 minutes. And so people were waiting for a long time, over an hour. And we were really worried that, oh my gosh, these people are going to wait all that long time, and then they're going to have their first experience in virtual reality, and it's not going to live up to this hour-long wait. And they're going to leave and think that virtual reality sucks, and it's going to be horrible. Luckily, virtual reality really saved our ass, because virtual reality in and of itself, regardless of what we happen to do with it, is so amazing and cool that people really enjoyed the fact. Maybe it has something to do with what we did too, but they just loved the fact that they had this experience that helped us. But we didn't want to repeat that the second year, so we came up the second year was this idea of having these chunks of time, 30 minutes, and a group of people comes in, and they all have tickets, and some of those tickets are marked as special tickets. The person gets to go in VR, or the person gets to be a non-VR participant. Everyone else is just in the audience. So right away upon coming in, they know what their role is, they know what the time is already from their tickets, and so everyone kind of knows from right away what's expected of them and what's going to happen, and nobody ends up waiting too long. And that worked out really well. It also ended up giving us this wonderful 30-minute arc that then we were able to really control and do things with, which ended up being a really great side benefit of that.
So in conclusion, we think that VR can be fun to watch. You just have to make sure you treat your audience as a first-class citizen.
And need to find really dynamic ways to connect the person in physical reality with the person in virtual reality.
And consider how your content unfolds, both over the short term to create an evolving space and a curiosity in your participants, but also think about the longer term so the audience stays engaged.
So we're not alone in this. Mike and Dare and I are three of the people, or parts of the Secret Portal. I've already talked about how Dawn, who helped us out with lights this last year, did such a wonderful job, and a lot of other people, the musicians who've been working with us, and other people who've helped us build the sets that we've using are all a member of this group, Secret Portal. We're all just really psyched about what virtual reality can do in public spaces, and we're going to keep doing it. We've been invited back to do another event at the Museum of Fine Arts that'll take place on December 14th. You can go to our website, and we'll be updating that as that event gets closer, about how to get tickets and how to be involved in that. There's our email. We've got business cards, and thank you all very much for being here tonight.
Questions? Any questions?
I saw a hand go up in the orange shirt right away first.
How would this change if you had augmented reality as opposed to virtual reality? You guys consider evolving into that space? The tech isn't really ready yet, but...
Yeah, we've talked about it a bunch. Of course, the hardware is not quite there yet. It's not very readily accessible, but definitely for the audience, it could be a tool that lets them peer right into the virtual world as opposed to either looking at the augmentations in the physical space or having to look at the screen. So that seems like an interesting way. You can. I think, with what I've seen with AR, it's social, right? You can have many people in the space, freely untethered, interacting with each other, seeing completely, perhaps a third reality. Who knows? We're super psyched about trying that out. Don't have real specific ideas yet, but definitely as the hardware comes along, that'll be another tool that makes this sort of thing even more amazing for people that aren't in VR.
When you guys were speaking about the audio setup and your 8-speaker setup that was informing the experience, was that an audio experience that both the person out of virtual reality and in virtual reality were experiencing, or did the person who was in virtual reality have their own audio setup?
No headphones. Yeah, that was the idea was to make everyone perceive it the same. Okay. So they're all getting spatialized audio because it's around everyone. So the audience hears it and the participants.
Yeah, that was one of the ways we really found to bridge it, that they're in these different worlds, but they're hearing the same thing.
Okay.
Do you guys come up with emotional goals beforehand, or do you kind of see where the game takes the players emotionally?
We had some emotional goals working, especially with our audio guy and Chris, who are amazing musicians. That and coming up with color palettes and sense of space, we kind of all riff off each other, and we really definitely wanted to come up with kind of emotional art.
Yeah, I think in our even first pitch for this, we didn't really know where you would go, what the environments would look like. But we did have this idea of an arc over time, and so the idea of bringing light to darkness as a theme, and starting mysterious and ending joyful. So that was sort of where we started, and then it evolved from there.
It was really great artistic collaboration, because we would I would say things I was interested in, Dare would say things he was interested in, and Guy would then kind of have some music that then would influence us more, and then Don would throw some lights on it that'd be awesome. So we really kind of bounced around, which was really great. Yeah.
So how do you fund this? Are there art grants available for VR?
We didn't profit from it personally, but we did get the organization that invited us was partnering with the MFA. It was for a Hanukkah celebration, and so they had invited us to do a piece, and that's why the light, bringing light to darkness, is just the theme of Hanukkah, the miracle of bringing light. So that was sort of part of this, and we did get a budget that paid for our equipment and for the musicians that we needed to pay to record the voices. But yeah, we're on a very shoestring budget, like a few $1,000s. We're hoping to find more opportunities for funding, sure.
I'm just wondering, what did you make the floor look like?
In virtual reality?
Yeah.
Did you do the texture on that? I think
We may have used.
I think we used some.
I think we may have used some freely available textures here and there. But yeah, it was sort of it was just like a stone surface. And the main thing was that people felt comfortable standing on it. They knew it didn't look like the kind of thing you could fall through. Yeah.
So you had some physical objects in the space, other than the held objects that existed in virtual reality and then in real reality. Did you find that the people in virtual reality touched those objects?
Yes, they did.
Was there a disconnect between their exact position?
No, those were exactly the same too. Those were the pyramids. They were the beacons that would light, and they were also exactly one-to-one. The size of the beacon and its location was exactly one-to-one to the beacons you would see. You wouldn't see all of them at the same time. They only in virtual reality you only see a few of those, and as you lit more and more of them, you would see more and more of them. And in the physical world, they would be lighting up as they were illuminated.
Was it a challenge to get their position correct?
No. It would be good because it was it wasn't for making the art. Lighting it up. No, in terms of making the art, I'll let Mike speak to the tech.
I mean, the thing was like a 15 by 15 square. And so all we needed to do when we got there was I had this weird thing where I just put my controller on the corner of the real floor, and then someone was sitting in the Unity editor making sure that the corner of the virtual world was where the controller was floating. And that's all we really needed to do. Now, we also we were a little freaked out about people tripping over stuff, so we didn't put stuff in the middle of the installation. We are interested in doing that, and I think now that I've experienced the Void, if anyone's heard about that, they're creating these attractions that are fully tactile, and I think that that would demand more precise registration. We may have been off by half an inch or something, and it was okay. People also had to get all the way to the edge and reach out. And since the person in VR was holding the torch in one hand, often the torch is what touched the sculptures rather than their hands. But I'm definitely interested in really going deep on that in our next thing.
In terms of the art side of it, it just meant just being very, very precise with my measurements in Unity and in 3ds Max, and so I was making everything exactly to scale. Like if it was an inch in the world, it was an inch, which meant also then a lot of translating into meters because Unity's in meters. So I had my centimeters to inches calculator going all the time to make sure everything.
He had modeled the entire room, so we had that exactly. We knew exactly where the center was going to be. We could just measure from the wall and set all the tables up.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you had a pretty large sample size for the VR experience. What was the percentage of people that experienced any type of discomfort or motion sickness or nausea from the VR?
I didn't hear anyone express that. Any motion sickness. No one said anything about motion sickness that I heard of. It's the HTC Vive is great. It works really well. We didn't do any motion of any kind. We had people, I think the youngest was maybe 8 or so, all the way up to 70s, 75. The people who were much older was interesting because I don't think they got how amazing it was. They were just I'm walking around somewhere. They didn't really even acknowledge that it was this crazy technology that was making it happen.
Yeah.
I think, well, a huge thing about VR right now is the interactivity between people in the virtual reality and people outside of it, obviously. And I think you guys are really breaking, I think you guys are really pioneering that. How does that get translated to the home? Like, if for example, for a platform game, how does the person inside the virtual reality either interact with the other person who's inside the virtual reality or with somebody who's potentially not in virtual reality at all?
I don't think I have the answer. I think just thinking about some of the design principles that we talked about, having information that's only available or visible to someone outside versus inside. The PlayStation VR has a social screen and it can render a different view. It can render information. You can take on a different role. I think Sony has a demo where a person in VR is like a monster, and they're shooting at characters that are controlled by gamepads. And so it's all about those, or maybe it's reversed. I can't remember exactly, but yeah.
Black Hat.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yeah, our good friend Sully. Yeah, has got just a great VR game where someone outside of virtual reality is looking at a screen and can see like the map, and someone is inside virtual reality having to navigate through this map, and so they're kind of sharing information with each other that way. And I think there are a couple other apps that do that too. There's one for Gear VR, I think, that's similar. Called
Someone diffusing a bomb.
Don't stop talking.
Don't stop talking is like that too. Yeah.
Have you thought about bringing in the sense of smell to bring in the audience?
It's
A little
interesting.
John Waters action, a little scratch and smell-orama.
Museums are really sensitive about. We wanted to have a smoke machine to have it be like super moody, and they were like, you cannot have a smoke machine in a museum. So okay. But maybe smells. Maybe smells are okay.
Scratch and sniff. The audience can have scratch and sniff cards.
Yeah,
Like the audience.
cover everything with scratch and sniff.
Did you ever go to that movie?
What?
Which Waters movie was that? It wasn't Pink Flamingos, was it? Which one was it that had smell-orama? What? I forget. Yeah, somebody can tell me afterwards. I forget the John Waters movie that had that.
Anyone else? Great. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.